Okay, our first person to make a presentation this morning is Mark Shapiro. When I came to the faculty of the school in 1983, Mark was a dominating presence on the school faculty. His insightful criticism, his intensity of interest, and his wealth of knowledge about the field and his enthusiasm for at least certain architects was palpable. And so I thought that Mark would be a very important and interesting person to many years later to come back to the school and to make some comments about Tulane and architectural education. So Mark.
All right. Well, I think it's always good to start with a quotation, and I'll use T.S. Eliot, who said, "The years between 50 and 70 are the hardest. You are always being asked to do things, and yet you are not decrepit enough to turn them down." That's why I'm here. On a more serious note, I would like to thank John and Dean Schwartz for the invitation to participate in this event. It's also very gratifying to me to see so many of my former colleagues and students in the audience. I think Michael Nias is here, and I particularly want to recognize him if he's actually in the room. There he is, my partner in practice and in teaching in the 80s. I will attempt to my... What the hell is going on? I will attempt in my brief remarks to say a few things about the school at the time I was here, and with any luck provide some insight into the nature of architectural education as it played out at Tulane between 1978 and 1985. This might perhaps at the end aid to a discussion of the nature of the school at present and some speculation as to the way forward. I still very much subscribe to what Colin Rose said in a piece written sometime before but published in Lotus 27 in 1980. And he said, "I presume architectural education to be a very simple matter, and the task of the educator, I am convinced, can be quite simply specified as follows. 1, to encourage students to believe in architecture and modern architecture. And 2, to encourage students to be skeptical about architecture and modern architecture. And 3, to cause students to manipulate with passion and intelligence the subjects and objects of their convictions and doubts." So to move on, keeping another quote, of course, got to use quotes, Marcel Proust, keeping his admonition in mind, remembrance of things past is not necessarily remembrance of things as they were. But before we embark on a discussion of Tulane, it might be useful for me to say just a little bit about myself, and maybe the reasons for this will become apparent given my later remarks. So this is not about puffing myself up and how great I am, but I think it's useful to understand a little bit about that to understand what I'm going to say later on. I was born in South Africa and received my architectural education at the University of Cape Town during the post-1968 worldwide student revolt, where I was taught by 3 remarkable people, namely the late Roelof Uyttenbogart, who had studied with Kahn at Penn and worked with David Crane in Boston, Adelmo D. Santos, who later became the dean at MIT, and her then husband, Antonio de Souza Santos, who was last at the New Jersey Institute of Technology after being at Rice and Toronto. He, by the way, also served as a Davis visiting critic or some lecture, some fancy lecture. He was here to do that. All of these individuals' work, although now somewhat obscure and unknown, I think is definitely worth looking up. And with the wonders of the internet, you can do that. Okay, the reason I raise this is that these figures provided, as well as a rigorous education, inspiration, and a model of what it means to be an architect and an educator. They provided a sense of connection from geographically isolated South Africa to a broader world of ideas and the debate about architecture in the period following the heroic period of the modern movement. Keeping in mind that I started architecture school in 1968, which was only 9 years after the last CIAM conference in Otterloo and the founding of Team 10, led by the Smithsons. More specifically, I think what they also taught was to think about architecture as integral to the idea of the city. I also was fortunate to have spent a year working in the then fledgling Foster practice in London. only like 25 people in the office at the time. After graduation and a stint working in Cape Town, I came to the Harvard GSD, where I was fortunate to encounter Peter Smithson as a studio critic and Jersey Sultan. I also became much more aware of the ideas of Colin Rowe through my classmates at Harvard who had graduated from Cornell. And that's where the connection begins. I really have no idea why the dean at the time, Bill Turner, hired me. I think it had something to do with the sudden departure of Bran Griffin for Houston. He sort of jumped ship and went to Houston. And the fact that other far more likely candidates had decided not to come to Tulane at the last minute. Anyway, I think it looked okay on paper. And what really sealed the deal for me was after a couple of good meals, including a memorable Pompano Pontchartrain at the eponymous hotel, and the prospect of imminent repatriation to darkest Africa, I came to Tulane at the tender age of 29, just a few years older than the students. So with that as background, we might approach those far-off times at Tulane. In the words of Charles Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, or we were all going direct the other way. So upon arrival and before coming, I knew something of the history of the school, including the previous dean, John Lawrence, who was a much admired educator and architect. Through Lawrence and Turner, the school seemed to also have a very strong connection to the ideas of Louis Kahn. And I think Steve Jacobs, the late Steve Jacobs, had also studied with Kahn at Penn. Of course, I was, or shortly became, aware of the significant preservation efforts of the school and the local profession in the so-called Battle of New Orleans that defeated the Riverfront Expressway and that would have severed the relationship of the French Quarter to the Mississippi River. Most important, of course, was the unique and particular nature of New Orleans with its urban condition and its particular architecture that could be understood as a living classroom. But maybe unlike some other great teaching cities like Rome or Florence, New Orleans seemed to lack, at least at first glance, and I'll get back to this in a moment, but seemed to lack a really significant presence of modern architecture. Of course, I was disabused of that pretty shortly. Also at the time, the school didn't seem to be the focus of progressive practice in architecture, although certainly the emerging work of people like Errol Barron was of interest. Nevertheless, I soon came to find out that the modernism to be found in New Orleans in the 40s, from the 40s, 50s, and early 60s was exemplary, and the output of firms like Curtis and Davis, Jim LaMantia, Albert Ledner, Goldstein, Perriman, Lebuis, Favrot and Wolf, so on, and Spangenberg, Bill Cologne, were, for me, two really outstanding examples, which you'll see on the screens here, was the International Longshoremen's Association building, which was constructed in 1959 by Lawrence and Saunders, and Charles Colbert's Weekly School, both of which, unfortunately, have been demolished. None of this seemed, at least to me, present in the life and consciousness of the school. Some of these architects were actually teaching in the school. You never heard about their work. They didn't. Jimmy LaMantia never spoke about his work. Nobody seemed to care. So none of this was really present in the consciousness of the school at the time. And it was only by exploring obscure neighborhoods and surrounding towns that I became aware of this work, which ultimately led to an exhibition and publication that I did together with Karen Kingsley called Modernism in Louisiana. And Karen has continued that work over the years. Despite this great legacy, by the late 70s, everything was all a bit tired and conservative, and the city was a host to some true horrors, such as the Superdome. Now, people are going to hate me for saying this, but a true horror like the Superdome, and most of the work that was built on Poitras Street. Maybe the John Hancock building, which was then the K&D building and is now something else on Lee Circle, and the 1966 Olivetti building by Charles Colbert are notable exceptions. On a more positive note, the Lawrence Lectures and the Davis Visiting Critic Chair were hopeful signs of vitality, with figures coming to the school like Aldo von Eyck, Herman Hertzberger, and many others, Charles Correa. Also important, at least for me, was the Tulane Rice competition, the second edition of which I was fortunate to direct, with Charles Moore, Hugh Hardy, and Colin Rowe acting as jurors. The arrival in 1980 of Ron Filson as the new dean had an immediate and significant impact. He established the Architectural Coalition as the research and practice arm of the school, which gave faculty members an opportunity to engage in practice. We carried out a number of projects, including proposals for the 1984 World's Fair. I think, unfortunately, it had to be abandoned. The coalition had to be abandoned because I think of objections from the local profession who thought it was unfair competition. Ron was able also to maintain a very active and high-quality lecture program, and I'm sure he had to use lots of tricks and sleights of hand to get the thing funded. Together with the ongoing Davis Critic and Lawrence Lectures program, brought people like Haig Beck, the editor of International Architecture, who produced, I don't know if it's still available, the New Orleans Architecture Guide, which is a terrific little analysis of New Orleans architecture. Henri Siriani, Aldo Rossi, Peter Eisenman, Charles Watney, Rem Koolhaas, Ken Frampton, and the list goes on and on. There was also a new generation of younger faculty arriving that nurtured a strong drawing and model culture, and also, John was for that group, a renewed interest in technology. I think in particular, in terms of that drawing and model culture, Bruce Goodwin and David Greger. Other notable changes were the founding of the Tulane Architectural Review, which I'm not sure is still going, that documented the work of the school every year. The first edition of which was edited by Franklin Adams and myself. Other events were also adding vitality to the scene. There was a 6 city sites project that Ron organized with the Preservation Resource Center, the New Orleans Museum of Art competition, and so on and so forth. It was also a time of the explosion of postmodernism. Charles Moore had completed the Piazza d'Italia, involved obviously in the World's Fair. So there was a huge sort of division in the school between the postmodernists, Charles Moore types, and then the typologists, Aldo Rossi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even Ken Frampton's publication on critical regionalism came out in the 80s. So there was definitely a kind of a sense of contention between two factions in the school, which I think was very healthy. And of course, it was the age of theory. So everybody had in their desk drawers, they had, Manfredo Tafuri and all these things that you couldn't really understand, but they were in the desk drawers. So because we couldn't understand them, I also started, I think, the first theory class at the school, which this reminds me a little bit of sitting up in the amphitheater above, still slightly hungover at 8:30 in the morning, trying to make sense out of Derrida. The other thing that Ron really encouraged and supported was an attempt to structure a coherent design curriculum. First 3 years of core, based on a series of lessons that would build one upon the other, followed by the more open system of platforms. And he also really encouraged and helped Michael and I really try and organize a much more rigorous review situation. Reviews used to be quite private affairs. People would hide out in some room and review their students' work. We got it all out in the open. Reviews were very, very public. There was a lot of contention, a lot of discussion. Probably didn't endear myself to some faculty. The other thing that was really important, I think, in the life of the school was the building. And even though there are still many shortcomings in the building, and there certainly were at the time, it's improved quite a bit, the positives about this building as a school of architecture far outweigh any negatives. Notably, the open loft studios that had once been, some of which had once been medical dissection labs. One of the slides you'll see scrolling through is medical students cutting up cadavers in what became the studios. And it makes one think in a way that what we were doing in those studios was having students dissect the body of knowledge of architecture in the studio. The library being in the building, which it still is, very, very positive. I just got a really nice note from a student reminding me that I'd sent him down to the library to look up a building by Le Corbusier. He's now, it's Gabe Smith, he's now a partner with Tom Pfeiffer. I got really dry mouth. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, you gotta stop the clock. Okay, so building, dispense with that. I think in the end, one other quick thing, there was also the broader campus environment. And a lot of students, I don't know if they still do, took art studio courses at Newcomb, and some of our much visually acute students availed themselves of that opportunity. Although I did not have a direct study abroad program at the time, there were two really important courses for the school. One was the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, and the other, of course, was the opportunity for students to study at the AA. And many of the best students did that. And the reason I bring it up is it was also a pipeline, what I mentioned before about connecting to a broader sort of architectural culture and context. So the idea that these students were going to the AA, going to the Institute, and then coming back with a kind of really sense of ideas in architecture. And I've got a whole list here of students that I was going to read out, but I can't do it. No time. So in the end, I think that, the time that I was here for me, it was sort of halcyon days of the school. Of course, everybody's time at the school is the halcyon days. But for me, it's like T.S. Eliot also said, I have a cat, you have a cat, but my cat's better than your cat. So I think that the success of a School of Architecture really depends on three things. I think it's the students primarily. Got to have energetic, committed students who are interested. The faculty, secondary, but still very important. And then the school has to have a connection to the idea of a broader world of ideas, a broader world of practice, a context that takes you outside of your little thing. And I think New Orleans is really interesting because it's so focused that it's sometimes difficult to maintain that notion of connection. It becomes too self-absorbed. And I think at the time, anyway, with those opportunities for students to go abroad to the Institute, it really sort of countered that in a very nice way. So I think my time's up.